Well, welcome everybody to the webinar on our Your 2020 Projects Shovel Ready, 6 strategies for being prepared. My name is Sergio Pages. I'm with StructureTech. I'm Senior Vice President and Chief Information Officer. I've been with StructureTech for the past 27 years, and it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm very grateful for the many people that have signed up. I have a pretty long list in front of me for many people coming from across the United States and Canada. So thank you again for joining us. This presentation germinated a few years back in 2015 as a result of challenges that we had at the time getting projects approved. And I got to tell you, you move fast forward, another 10 years, and here we are again. The problem's still the same. Last week, for example, I visited several facility managers in different parts of the country, and the challenge of funding projects continues to be the #1 concern across facility managers. So hopefully this presentation will give you some insights, things that I've learned in my career and talking to many people across the country that are struggling with the same issue of getting funding for your projects. And in this particular case, we're going to hone in on, how do we get projects so that they're shovel ready? In other words, we can turn them on a dime, get them started as soon as possible, as soon as the funding gets in. So starting one of the factors that at least for-profit corporations struggle with is the fact that we're relying on results, market forces. Is the company doing well? Are we profitable? It's our plant generating the necessary revenue to justify that roof replacement that we've been begging corporate to give us funding for. Or, is the quarter doing well? Is our annual revenues going to go well? We have a lot of market forces that are affecting whether the CFO is going to be able to allow you to use the funding you've been asking for years. Other forces are internal. We're competing with other departments that are asking for funding, and us in the facilities management world are usually the last ones, and we have to make a really strong case to get the funding. Otherwise, we'll lose it against somebody else. That hospital that needs an MRI unit will usually allocate the funding for those systems because they create revenue, or that production line that needs a new robotic system will take precedence over a parking lot, as an example. So it's a constant battle trying to compete with others in getting that funding. Other factors for institutional, for example, schools, we're relying solely on tax money, and we're waiting for bonding dollars to get approved. And usually, cities and counties are not approving tax increases. So we have challenges in being able to get funding for maintaining those schools or those buildings that need the attention that they should have. So those are some of the forces we're struggling with. However, we have put a plan together, and then suddenly the CFO or the board or management releases it, and you're not ready. So the intent of this presentation is, how do we, what kind of strategies can we use to be prepared when that funding does happen? How do we get, shovel ready? We can turn on a dime when that funding comes in and go immediately into construction and start replacing those boilers or those roofing systems or that parking lot that we need to take care of. So to start with, I want to show you an example or share with you an example of a case where it's not an ideal situation of being shovel ready. This particular story has got to do with a facility that was owned by an aerospace manufacturing company. In order to prepare for funding, this individual, like many of us, got the funding by asking 3 contractors, 3 local contractors for numbers to replace his parking lot. In order to get a good budget, he got quotes from 3 people, and those quotes came in, and he went ahead and took the highest quote and added another 20% for contingency, and that's what he submitted to the CFO. Fast forward, that funding gets approved, and he's about to proceed to execute this project. However, upon further analysis, when you look at this quote, and perhaps you can't see it on the screen, but basically it's a detailed quote that shows the type of pavement mixes that they were going to use in this particular lot, with some caveats about it. And this project was about $500,000. The challenge with this is that what the facility manager did not know is that the location where he was at had a very high level water table. So this $500,000 that he was about to invest on his parking lot would have been a good case of using the money that he was given. However, probably within 2 to 3 years, the investment would have gone south as a result of not having the proper design and the proper information to execute the work. Now, the good news is we actually were able to perform some engineering analysis. We did some geotechnical analysis on the lot, and we were able to reallocate the $500,000 and do a project that will last 20 years for the site. Another example, this is more of a good example, is an automotive supplier in Detroit that wanted to get funding for a fairly large roofing program, roof replacement program for a facility that they intended to use for many years. So what we did in conjunction with the facility manager is we performed an evaluation, and here's a picture of the roof. So we did a complete assessment on this, and we came up with about $1 million that it was going to cost. This facility is a key building for the portfolio of buildings that they have. They intended to stay for many years, so the intent was to ask for funding that will last at least 20 years for the replacement. So in order to make a strong case for the request, for the capital request of $1 million, we were able to give a presentation to the CFO that showed the deficiencies of the roof, and then we actually performed some infrared analysis as well, and we were able to get the budget approved by the CFO. So, going back to the summary here, we presented the case. Now, this was a little tricky, as many of you know. We didn't get the full $1 million approved, but what we did is we got the design for that roof approved, the design and the bidding process. So what we went ahead and designed it, bid it out, and had it ready so that they could submit it. This outfit, the headquarters is in Germany, so they submitted the budgets back to Germany, and then the funding got approved for the full $1 million. So the strategy here is that what they did is they funded the engineering up front as an expense, and then once the bid came back and we had a hard number, then we were able to transfer that expense to the capital project and capitalize the project. So good strategy. We were able to execute the project, in a timely fashion, and actually came under $1 million. So we were able to actually give back some funding to the CFO for the project. Another example, and this is a energy company, utility provider. What their approach for shovel-ready projects is they have a portfolio of 100-plus sites that they have throughout the country. And what they did is they developed a comprehensive list of capital projects that were done based on a condition assessment that was done every year on the 100 sites. And then based on the conditions that we were able to identify, we developed a plan. And then every quarter, depending on the financial results of the company, projects were being released on a timely basis. And then one thing that one of the strategies that we had is at the end of every year, we selected likely projects that were going to be executed. They will release the design, and then perhaps we will design 20 projects, and out of those 20, only 10 will go. But then we will shelve the rest of the projects and then do them in future years as projects are being released. This next slide is an example of that list. In this particular case, we had 6 projects throughout Ohio and Indiana, ranging from $100,000 to $200,000-$300,000 projects. And this way, not only were we shovel ready to execute these projects from a design perspective, but also the funding was secured up front. So good examples of how to plan ahead. So as we get into this, I would like to basically break down this presentation into 6 strategies on having a shovel-ready project. So with that, I want to highlight each one of them, and we will go into each one of them in detail. The first strategy is make sure you have a very clear definition of the scope of work. Now, what does that mean? We want to do a good condition assessment on a regular basis, have a list ready that is ranked on a condition index. I'll elaborate on that. And then define a risk index, and I will expand on that a little bit more later. And then strategy number 2 is make sure that you have good budgets that are well defined. Man, nothing's worse than coming in way too below the budget you had, or worse, coming ahead of the budget that you submitted to the CFO. Number 3, make sure you have specifications ready, well-defined specifications. Good project that is well-defined, you'll have less chances of risk, less chances of change orders. Strategy number 4, you want to make sure you're working with the right team. Select a team that you can trust, that you have, that they have experience in the type of projects that you have. And then strategy number 5 is select a project delivery method that suits the objectives of time constraints. We'll elaborate on several project deliveries depending on the type of projects that you have. And then last is timing your bidding event. The timing of bidding is crucial nowadays. This year, because of the pent-up demand and the shortage of labor, prices have been all over the map. So the sooner you can get the bid event out, the better. So we'll elaborate on that a little bit more. So this next slide kind of shows you a chart on how close can you be to be shovel ready. So going from left to right, at the beginning, you want to have a good evaluation of your assets. You don't have a good grasp on your assets, on the condition of your assets. It's very hard to develop a project. You're going to be relying on contractors' quotes, like that example that I started with. And then you want to have a very good prioritization index, and we'll expand on that throughout the presentation, and then put budgets together. So by doing these tasks, you will be between 20 to 30% ready for that project. The next part is to scope it, to define the scope, and we recommend that you have a good design development process where you determine the conditions that you need in order to execute the project. Develop a good project manual that is based on the Construction Specifications Institute, and then select the project delivery method. That will get you anywhere from 70 to 80% ready. And then lastly, the bid event. If you bid early, or perhaps you negotiate with somebody you trust, but again, trust and verify. Make sure you have a good set of specifications that you can negotiate with, and a good group of partners that can provide checks and balances on the pricing. And then, bid the project prior to the funding approval. I know it's risky, and sometimes contractors don't like that, but it's a way to be shovel ready, and in the minute those funds show up, you can proceed to mobilize the contractor. So let's go into the first strategy, and that strategy is scope of work is defined, okay? So what does that mean? Well, first, you want to perform a condition assessment on your assets on a regular basis. You want to have a very comprehensive list that is ranked based on how, how the conditions are of each site. And then the last thing is define what is called a risk index. So let's talk about the condition assessment. The condition assessment essentially is, getting boots on the ground, doing a physical condition survey of your assets on a regular basis. Make sure that, and I love this statement, I've been using it for the last 30 years, let the current conditions dictate your recommendations. In other words, make sure that the conditions of your parking lot, the conditions of the roof, the condition of your walls are dictating the recommendations. Are we going to replace them? Are we going to repair them? You want to make sure you're investing the money in the right way for the project. And then make sure that that investment is aligned or is in accordance with your organization corporate goals. What does that mean? If you're going to invest on a parking lot or replace a roof, you want to make sure that that building is going to be in your portfolio for years to come. Otherwise, the point will be, it wouldn't be worth putting funding in things that the corporation is already thinking about divesting. So let's go in a little deeper into the physical evaluation survey. If you're going to do an assessment of the conditions of your assets, you want to make sure that the individuals that are going to be inspecting these assets have the expertise. So for example, if you're going to have somebody inspect the roofs, you want to have a roofing expert, a consultant that understands how roofs age, how they're built, what are their strengths and weaknesses, and that way they can give you a good perspective on how much service life that roof has. Same thing applies for other assets, such as pavement. You want to have a good team that understands what's the structural condition of that parking lot. Is it structurally unsound? Is it you don't want to put more striping and coating on it because it's just not going to have any more service life. You want to have an expert that knows that. In the paving industry, for example, there is a methodology called the PACER approach, or the PACER method, that allows you to systematically rate your parking lots in a very common, used by every Department of Transportation across the country, on what condition that lot is in. So again, using the right people to assess these parking lots and determine how much service life they have is an important part of this process. Another level of assessment other than the visual is to perform some testing, kind of like you go into the doctor and you want to get some blood samples and get a little deeper into this, or perhaps you need to do some x-rays. Same thing with buildings. For example, in a roof, you might want to take some cores. And this next slide shows you an example of an individual doing a test cut on your roof. Now, why do we want to do a test cut? Well, many reasons. One is it will tell us the construction of the roof. It will tell us if there's any wet insulation. And it gives us information about, the condition of the roof, how old is it, and whether it's going to last, how long it's going to last. Another type of test that is typical on building envelope systems on walls or facades. Many times, and I've been involved in literally hundreds of forensic evaluations where even though we have good drawings for the building, what we are seeing, why the building's leaking or why it's having issues, is something that we have to explore a little deeper. So many times it's a good idea to perform an exploratory opening. What does that mean? Removing some bricks, removing a window, a particular type of wall to see what the concealed conditions are there. That gives you more information about why that wall, for example, is leaking or is having some structural concerns. In the civil side, it's important that when you're assessing your parking lots, that you take samples of the soils that are underneath those parking lots. The language that we use is soil borings. And in this picture, we see an equipment system here drilling a hole on a site so we can get an idea of the soil conditions underneath the lot. Now, why is that important? Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, if you were to discover that the water table is high in this area, the type of recommendation for a replacement of the lot or the parking lot will be different if you didn't know that information. And of course, if you're going to put $200,000-$300,000 into a new parking lot, you want to make sure you're not going to have something that is short-lived. So having geotechnical information about your pavement, your parking lot, is a very important step in doing a good condition assessment. It gives you the right information to have a good project to be shovel-ready, as I have been talking about. Other type of testing may be non-destructive, and I'm going to mention a couple of technologies. The first one is the thermal imagery scan, and basically is the use of infrared technology. Many of us are familiar with that technology from the military. The military uses it for war purposes and for other applications. And in the facilities, we've been using it for internal heat and electrical analysis. And in the roofing industry, it's used to evaluate your roofs and determine the condition of your insulation to see if there's any water infiltration in your roof. Here's this image here shows you a picture taken from a camera at night where it tells you the areas that are wet, which are the red area. Okay, next, once you complete your survey, then it's important that you prioritize your list. Okay, how many, what is my priority? What projects should I prioritize? And obviously, it's going to be based on the different conditions that they're in. So that takes me into the next slide, which is very important that you understand the service life of the different systems that you own or that you're managing. So, for example, a window system may have a 30-year lifespan, but based on the condition of the glazing system, it's at the end of its life. So you have to determine whether you're going to replace it with something that's going to be more energy efficient and has a longer span of life. With a roofing system, you may also be in the range of 10 to 20 years of service life. So if you're catching a roof that is at the end of that life, do that analysis from a life cycle cost analysis. Here's an example of a condition index that we use, and it's a blend of roofing, walls, and pavement, but essentially what we do is you rate systems from 0 to 100, and anything that's below a 50 is a candidate for capital work. In other words, we have determined that the parking lot or the roof is at the end of its service life, and really putting more repair money into it will just make it, it's just not going to extend the life of that system. So therefore, any condition index that is below a 50 is rated or is slated for capital improvements. And then above the 50 is where you will do funding for operations and strategic repairs. So that's the condition index. This next slide, it's a very good example of what we call the asset renewal model. And essentially what you see on the left is, the highest rating, that you have in a system, 100 being, like, for example, a perfect roof that's in good condition, and it has a service life of 18 years. But as time goes by, the condition index starts lowering, and having a good maintenance plan will allow you to, perhaps have that roof move from 18 to 23 years. So again, part of your funding is to make sure that you're allocating funding for the right purposes so that you can extend the life of those systems that have that potential, and those that don't, then use the funding for the replacement of those systems. Here's a quick example of a portfolio of about 5 million, almost 5 million square feet of roof that was evaluated, and you can see the breakdown in this particular example. 19.92% it's in poor condition. 13.89% is in very poor condition, and there is a 2.33% that it has failed. In other words, it's a safety concern. So this type of analysis allows you to prioritize those projects that make sense to execute. This next one is very similar, except for it's more for facades or exterior walls, and you can see the breakdown of the condition index here too. And then lastly, another example is a pavement model. This is using the PACER model that I mentioned earlier. And again, very similar approach. Anything that's below a 50 is capital work, and then anything above a 50 is slated for maintenance and operation dollars. Lastly, we have a more of a risk index, or a prioritization that is more aligned with the corporate goals that I mentioned earlier. So for example, you may have a portfolio of, let's say, 100 buildings, and there's a group of buildings that you intend to, the corporation has long-term plans. They're planning to stay there for 20 plus years. I work with a number of universities that, have anything that's less than 30 is short-term. Anything that's above 30 is long-term. So categorizing your buildings based on the long-term strategic value of the building for the organization. Then you have other categories, buildings that perhaps you're not sure you're going to keep them, so they're medium range. And then there's always those buildings that are short-term. In other words, the corporation is not interested in investing in those sites. They're starting to divest them, and that will make a big impact on whether the project gets approved or not. So it's important that you know what category your building is in terms of the corporate perspective on the building. Before we go on to the next slide, I just want to encourage anybody that has any questions. There is a place on the screen where you can send us questions. I'll be answering them at the end, but I want you to make sure that you feel free that if there's questions you have, you can type them on the screen there. So, okay, so let's talk about the second strategy, and this strategy is basically preparing your budgets. The budgets need to be connected with the course of action that you determine in the evaluation condition assessment process. In other words, if you are going to put a budget for replacement, you want to make sure that it's tied in with that analysis that you did. The other is you want to make sure that you develop a long-term approach. You're not going to get all the projects funded. So what you want to do is set it up in we usually recommend a 5-year increment. That way, as funding gets approved, you can keep sliding, and some move from year 1 to year 2 and so on. Another very good strategy is to put alternates in your thinking, in your plan. In other words, I may not be able to do all 4 roofs, the same way. I may have some alternatives. Maybe I'll do partials, or maybe I'll take some other approaches. And should the funding come below my expectation, I can go and proceed with those alternate options that we develop. And then lastly, unit pricing, very important that you stay on top of unit pricing. Nowadays, it is very challenging given the strong challenge in the country with labor. We just don't have as many craftspeople, so the contractors are continually struggling with labor, and that's affecting unit pricing for different types of projects. So very important that you stay on top of that so that you can avoid those close cost overruns during the bidding process. And then again, the example that I mentioned, or the discussion I had earlier about the life cycle cost. The point that is critical in your analysis is, think in terms of annual cost of ownership. I'm going to put this kind of money into this parking lot, or into this roof replacement, or into this facade restoration. What is my annual cost of ownership of the project? Don't just look at the first cost. So in this very crude example, we have $100,000 with an annual cost of $10,000, or perhaps we could be investing $125,000, but then our annual cost of ownership is $8,300. And the number keeps going down. So think in terms of economies of scale. The more you can do, the better pricing you're going to get, the better engineering you put into it, the longer the system's going to live, and they therefore will give you the lowest cost of annual ownership. Going back to my slide that I shared earlier, basically we just talked about the first group of strategies. Having a shovel-ready program. You want to have a good condition assessment, have a good prioritization scheme with indexes, and then having good budgets. Now that's good. However, that gets you about 20 to 30% ready. Next step is to get into scope definition. So let's get into the scope definition. What does that mean? Okay. Well, as I mentioned in my first example, the classic approach that most facility managers do is rather than writing an engineering spec for their parking lots, for example, or for the roofs or the facades, what they typically do is get quotes from different contractors without specifications. The challenge with that approach is that you're not going to compare apples with apples. In addition to that, you're not going to get the expected annual cost of ownership that you could get if you were doing an engineering approach. So having specs ready, developing a project manual is critical. So in terms of how to go about that, what I highly recommend, and this comes from the from the world of new construction, is basically take an engineering firm, a consultant, or even your own staff, and put together a spec that is solid. Okay, make sure you have good specifiers that know the different types of materials. For example, in the pavement world, it's very important that you take advantage of the Department of Transportation in your particular city or region, and use the mixes that pertain to that city, and incorporate them into your specs. In terms of roofing, you want to make sure you have very clear definition of types of roofs that you're going to be scoping for the project. In terms of facades, you want to do the same thing. Make sure you have very detailed drawings and information pertaining to those systems. So a good project manual is critical, and it's good that you coordinate and have a good process to get some quality drawings and a good project manual that is put out so that a contractor is going to be able to bid the work, and that way you get comparable prices from them. I'm going to share with you an example of a project manual. This happens to be a roof replacement project for a couple of roof areas. The first part of the spec is a typical, what is called a CSI standard. It's broken down into the first part is the bidding requirements. What are the rules of engagement? What what kind of contractors do I want to invite? You know, I want to have a good set of contractors that have done these type of roofs, and we don't want to have just any contractor. We also want to have a contractor that has um, good financials so that they can finish the job without going into bankruptcy. So we want to have good contracting requirements that abide by the organization. And then we have a summary of work and the very specific details that pertain to that project. In addition to the technical specifications, we also want to provide very clear definition with drawings. It's site drawing for the roof, for example, also very specific details. In this example, for example, we have 28 very custom-made details for the different roof transitions, penetrations, and you know, every step of the way, so that there's no confusion by the contractor of what we're expecting them to do. Here's some illustrations of details that very clearly explain to the contractor, you know, how we want to tie this roof to a wall, so that there's no confusion about how they're going to do that. So it's critical that you have good details to you know, write the specifications. So having a good spec and a good project manual is definitely a key component of having a shovel-ready project. The next strategy is making sure you have a right team. Okay, so in construction, as many of you know, you got to have a good designer, a good engineer, a good consultant, a good architect that's going to help you determine, you know, how this project is going to work when you're ready to pull the trigger. You also want to have a good pool of contractors that you have worked in the past, or perhaps other people around your area. They have a good reputation around there. So having that external team aligned so that when that funding comes, you can just pull the trigger with that team is critical. And then, of course, your own internal resources, you know, the project managers that you have on staff, and then yourself as a facility manager. So going a little deeper, what are some of the attributes for that right team? You want to have a design team and a contractor team that has, you know, good, solid technical background on the type of work that you're going to have done here. You know, if it's a parking lot, you want to make sure that the engineer of record, the civil team understands every aspect of pavement, drainage issues. If it's a roofing project, you want to make sure that they understand roofing technologies and how they work together. If it's a facade project, you want to make sure that they understand different types of facades, whether it's EIFS systems, masonry, curtain walls. You want to make sure you're working with an experienced team that has done this before. And then very important that they communicate with each other, that they have good relationship. And I'm not talking about being friends necessarily, but having good checks and balances on process, on methods, and the technology that they will be using throughout the project. Okay, now the next strategy is selecting a project delivery method. And there's several approaches that you can execute a project. I'm going to go into each of them into detail. But the first project delivery method that's become very popular in the last few decades is the design build approach. And essentially, this is a model where you can go probably the fastest in terms of execution of a shovel-ready project, where you have only one entity that you're expecting them to be completely responsible for the project. And that way you don't have to worry about having multiple parties. And that approach, you know, you have the design professional and the contractor working as one single source. It's more of a turnkey approach. You know, some advantages of that, obviously, you know, single point of responsibility. Of course, it's got to be an entity that you trust. And then probably the biggest advantage of this approach is that it reduces the delivery time. It allows you to execute the project much faster than other methods because obviously the design overlaps with the construction timeframes and allows you to make quicker decisions, and it reduces the amount of change orders. The other advantage is obviously the cost can be lower because you're getting the project done much faster. And then hopefully there's less dispute resolutions because you're dealing with one entity that's going to be completely responsible for this project. Obviously, there is disadvantages. You know, you're not as involved in the performance of the work because you're basically delegating it to them. And then obviously, this model doesn't work for many companies or many organizations. So there's some situations where that's not allowed. You know, for example, in public work, sometimes that model doesn't work or is not legal. So, okay, the next project delivery method is it's probably what I consider the most traditional model, and it's called the design bid build. And that's basically you have different parties. You have an architect, engineer that's going to be in charge of the design, and then you have the builder. It's more of a linear process. Basically, the engineer is putting together the specifications as I mentioned them, and then there's a bid event. You invite, you know, 10, 15 contractors to bid the project, and then of course the low bidder, most qualified, ends up with the project. But probably the biggest difference is that you as the owner will hold a contract directly with the designer and a contract directly with the contractor or builder. What are the advantages of this model? You know, sometimes depending on your strengths, your skill sets, it might be easier for you to manage. You actually can participate in the design process and have more control. One of the things that I really enjoy about this model, which I've done, you know, for 2 decades, is the participation in the design development process. The interaction between the owner and the engineers in terms of selecting the materials, determining who they're going to invite, determining what type of products, what type of contracting, what sort of methods, and even in design. It's just a lot of fun because you're designing together for a common cause. So that's obviously an advantage. You can develop a very strong design prior to construction because there's no overlap. And then the designer may be more active in the construction phase as an owner's rep during construction. And this process obviously allows you to you know, be able to understand it because everybody's familiar with this process. So, okay, so now the disadvantage is obviously it's more linear. Sometimes it can be painfully slow, and that's obviously one thing that you want to make sure you have time for that process. There might be a conflict among parties because you're dealing with 3 different personalities or entities. In you know, separating the design and construction may be an impact on the communication, you know, finger pointing in terms of the design and the construction companies. And then it might have an impact on change orders throughout the project if it's not, if it wasn't well thought out up front. So the last method is the construction management model. This is basically very similar to the design build, except that you have an owner who hires a CM and a designer who then contracts a contractor. So it's basically very similar to the other 2, except that you have a construction manager that basically takes all the responsibilities for managing the contractor or contractors, depending on the complexity of the project. Some advantages associated with this. You know, it might make sense if you don't have the staff that are familiar with this type of projects. It might be easier for you to do that. And then obviously a big advantage from a shovel-ready perspective is that you can, you know, ask the construction manager to, you know, do the design and construction concurrently and be able to expedite this. You know, one thing that I've been seeing the last few years of this model is that many companies have challenges with funding that expires before the end of the year, and there's not enough time to execute the project and to use the funding. And that comes out really good when you're working with a construction manager that can take the funds, escrow them, and then execute the project at a later date. That's one of the approaches that I've seen this model being very well used. So some disadvantages regarding this model: it might be a little bit more costly because you're adding more management for the CM. The value of the CM depends on the timing of the services. There might be some disputes between the construction manager and the designer. It's something you have to watch out for. One of the challenges too is that you're putting too much emphasis on the first cost and not necessarily in the long term. So that's something that you have to set up front, the expectation of the owner wanting a low cost of annual cost of ownership, so that they're not taking any shortcuts on the project. So, and then lastly, I just want to illustrate this three models from a timing perspective. You can see clearly the design build model takes a little bit longer. This is just looking at a sample 12-month program. And the design build definitely is faster because you can overlap the design process with the construction process. And the construction management is probably the next one that it saves you time, but obviously the design build is usually the fastest model. Now, how do you select that? You want to make sure that it's depending on the factors, many factors, the scope of work. Is it a complicated project? If it's a complicated project, sometimes the design build might not be the best approach. If your schedule is a priority, the design build makes sense. If you're looking for value or you have issues with approving vendors, I have, for example, some entities that they have very hard time getting contractors because of the insurance requirements. So what they do is they hire a construction manager that can take on the insurances that are required to work with that entity, and then they turn around and hire companies that can execute very specialized projects, and that way they avoid the delay of getting somebody approved for the work. So many aspects that you have to take into consideration. Your budget constraints, and then schedule will determine what type of project delivery method you should use. Also, performance. Do I have the right team in place to assign? If you don't have the right team, then none of this makes sense. You have to make sure you're tying it in with, who you trust and what kind of companies you're working with. I mentioned complexity. Is the project very complex? Are you going to have multiple trades involved? So therefore, you may need a more support in terms of the management. And then the risk factors. Is this a data center that cannot possibly have any issues during construction? It's very sensitive, or maybe it's a security site, or maybe it's an entrance to an emergency room in a hospital. So all those considerations need to be considered when you're determining the project delivery method. So what are the attributes of a successful project? Make sure that you're able to make timely decisions, that you have excellent scope definition, you have an excellent team that communicates, that has the technology tools to go back and forth with each other. So the selection of the designer and contractor has to be very well thought out, so that you're bringing in the right team. Very, very important that you do that. So this is a quick check that explains basically the best application for delivery methods. Strategic maintenance, restoration, major capitals, when you have a tight budget, when your issues are schedule and fast track. So it's just a quick example of what method makes sense for you. So I highly encourage you to review this. There's a lot of information out there on this, and it could really make a difference in getting you ready for a project. So, lastly, in this particular subject, I want to share this example. This is an example of a shovel-ready design-build project. Very complicated. This is a hospital where it had a green roof over very sensitive surgical operating room areas. So given the sensitivity of the project and the fact that it was not constructed well and it was already leaking in some of these key areas, they decided to perform a very comprehensive evaluation in order to design a roof that will not leak. But given that they also wanted a healing area, a place where people could walk, given the fact that it's a hospital, you were going to put green components on top of it, which created another level of complexity. And then obviously the issue with a roof of this type is you're going to have water on top of the roof at all times because you have vegetative components there. So you have to have a very good drainage system. And then the other factor is that because of the fact that there's surgical rooms underneath, you have to get this project done in a very fast approach. So the model that was used was a design-build approach, and we had to design it up front, and then we had a 5-day window to complete the project so that we could, not disrupt the operations underneath. So a good example of using a design-build model for a very critical situation here. Okay, and then the last strategy is bidding, timely bidding. One of the challenges with bidding, especially in today's markets, which have been absolutely brutal this year, is we just have a lot of issues with the current market trends. There's just a tremendous concern with labor shortages, as I mentioned earlier. There's also issues with scheduling constraints. For those of us who are in the northern parts of the United States and Canada, the weather is very key. We can't do projects except for April to October. And sometimes, you get into October and it gets risky. And then just dealing with material increases, cost, it's just a moving target. So what we recommend is that you plan your timing very strategically. This is just an example that we did this year, just in a scale that shows you that the earlier that you bid the project, the better pricing you're going to get. So as you get into the late summer, especially for those of us in the northern states, the late bidding in the summer, it's always much more challenging. So we highly recommend that you bid as early as possible. Plus, it gets you in front of the contractor's backlog so that you can get in front of their schedules there. So, okay. So lastly, obviously, you want to be ready to show the impact of your investment, and that is done by everything we just talked about today. You want to make sure you're prioritizing. As I mentioned, you want to also take into account cost reduction. Again, that annual cost of ownership. You don't want to look at things as first cost. You want to make sure you're planning for a sustainable program so that your projects are going to be maximized. Once you get that funding, you want to make sure your funding is going to be on something that's going to last more than just 3-5 years, but more into the 20-year plus investment. So with that, thank you very much. Very grateful for your attendance. I see a lot of questions, so please dial in, or if you have any future questions, you can reach me at structuretech.com, and we can help you with with any projects that you may have for 2020. I get a question here from one of the participants. How do I get buy-in to get my projects shovel ready without approved capital? That's a great question. Basically, the answer is you want to make sure you're building a very strong case for your project. Everything we've been talking about is about building that case. My experience with many facility managers around the country is that 9 out of 10, they're not articulating well what they're asking for. They're not building a business case for the request for funding. They're walking in with quotes from contractors, and I'm telling you, CFOs do not like that. They want to see that you've done your analysis, you've done your studies, and build a very good case, because you're asking for funding that's competing with other entities in the hospital or in your corporation. So for you to walk in with not the right information to request funding is very important. So another question, why is there such a cost increase as construction season approaches? Well, basically, especially institutional work, it's released typically in April so that it gets executed in June. Many school work, they have to get it done during the summer because that's when the kids are out of school at universities and K through 12. So that work gets let out and basically depletes the number of contractors that are going to be able to bid your work. So if you released a bid in the middle of August, for example, or July, they will obviously bid higher because they got their backlogs full. So that's the main reason why later in the year it becomes more expensive. So next question, how long in advance should my project be shovel ready? You know, I think it's based on that condition index. The sooner you know those indexes, they will tell you the service life that you have left on those systems. You don't want to be asking for a capital project as a result of a roof collapse. You know, that's when you're going to pay through the nose because it wasn't well planned and you ended up deferring it so long that now it's become a safety issue. So the more proactive you are, the better. So the sooner, the better. So with that, thank you everybody for joining me. I'm really grateful that you took the time to listen to me, and I wish you the best of 2020. Thank you. Bye-bye.